Morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And to your introduction, Yancy, I think it's very important that the scientific community are engaged in this debate, fact-checking everything. And that's something that we desperately need, and I guess including the stuff that we say. So I look forward to the discussion and the interrogation of what we have. I'm going to share my presentation, hopefully, and then jump in. So I've tried to keep it relatively high level, and then sort of dip into some of the detail, but really to give you a sense of the complexity of the transition and the just energy transition. And I try to make the point that we talk about the just energy transition, but actually it's a transition for the whole of the economy, and that's key. So I'm going to whip through the presentation and then look forward to questions and discussion. So just some context. For those of you who don't know, the Presidential Climate Commission, we were established by the President to advise Cabinet and the President himself on how we might achieve a just transition. So our focus is very much on the just transition. There are sort of 30-odd commissioners, 10 ministers, and then commissioners from various parts of society, business, labor, civil society, youth, government, etc. And the commissioners are the people who make the recommendations and who represent these sort of various social partners. The Secretariat, which is where I work, takes direction from those commissioners, does the research, organizes the programs, and sort of writes up the reports. But just to make the point that the recommendations are made by the commissioners. Our sort of core goal really is consensus building, and so we do lots of stakeholder engagement, and I'll share some of the insight that we've had from that. So earlier this year, even end of last year, we released what is called the Just Transition Framework. And this is really intended to describe our ambition for the just transition as a whole. So bearing in mind that we're not just talking about energy here, we're talking about the economy as a whole. And so really to think about how the global climate transition presents opportunities for South Africa to transition and for us to transition in a way that really makes a meaningful impact on the triple bottom line of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. The core thing about the framework was that it was adopted by Cabinet and now has to infiltrate its way into government planning, budget setting, KPI setting, and so on, so that hopefully we see these just transition elements embodied in how we think about economic transitions. Why do we think this is important? You know, all this, 49 to 50% of people in South Africa live in poverty. We have amongst the highest Gini coefficient in the world, which means we have amongst the highest inequality in the world. And when I say amongst the highest, we are the worst. We have the highest inequality in the world. And we have 33% unemployment. Obviously, these numbers vary a little bit over time. And the unemployment numbers are scary when you drill down to kind of provincial level. So Mpumalanga has higher unemployment and has youth unemployment, sometimes quoted at 60%. And so there are very real social problems that need to be addressed. And this really should be the core of our transitional goals. Climate, of course, provides very important strategic framing. And what you will hear and know as scientists that climate change, South Africa warms at twice the rate of the global average. So when they talk about keeping warming below 1.5 degrees, that means 3 degrees for South Africa. And you can kind of see in this chart here that we're in this kind of warming hotspot. 2 degrees means 4 degrees. But even then, within South Africa, varying degrees of warming. So the Western Cape warms much worse than some of the other parts of the country. And so what does this mean? So the IPCC cycle assessment reports that come out relatively often every couple of years are an assessment of the global science on climate change, and they come out in 3 working groups. The working group 1 that looks at sort of climate impacts, working group 2 looks at adaptation responses, and working group 3 looks at mitigation responses. This last IPCC report was really interesting because they specifically look at Africa. And from a science community perspective, there's a fascinating chapter, if you haven't yet read it, on research in Africa. And I forget the numbers, but some quite horrifying stats that most of the research done in Africa is done by northern universities in Africa, or northern professors funded to work in Africa. And we really have to build the research capacity of African universities looking at African problems. But a big step forward in the IPCC work is this fact, or this chapter on Africa. And some of the impacts described in that chapter are a 34% reduction in agricultural output due to climate change, more than any other region in the world. So this is Africa-wide. Reduced income and growth and increased income inequality for African countries when compared to Northern Hemisphere. So we are having proportionally more damage and proportionally more income disparities. Over 3.6 million weather-related displacements. So this is the whole migrant issue. So 3.6 million people displaced by climate, either slow burn climate or extreme weather events, and a negative 5% impact on GDP per capita for South Africa. So these are very real threats. And the scary thing is that these are things that have already happened. These are the stats that are projected, and I wish I could be in the room with you all to see you gasp of surprise, but don't know how you're reacting to this data. But if we think about what's projected, they're saying a further 25 to 75% reduction in agricultural output, depending on crop, 50% drop in South Africa's GDP by 2100, and with 1.7 degrees of warming. So bearing in mind we're already at 1.1, 1.2, and we're projected to go to 3. With 1.7, we'll have 17 to 40 million climate migrants in sub-Saharan Africa alone, and that increases to 56 to 86 million people for 2.5 degrees. So these are very real challenges that we need to address. And so climate as a framing issue is very important. Not only are there physical risks to climate change, there are also what they call transitional risks, so risks that are imposed on the economy based on things like international policy, trade, technology change, and so on. And this is our trading partner comparison. This is some work that was done by the National Business Initiative, but basically looking at with whom do we trade. And you can see that the bulk of our trade goes to countries that have made some kind of net zero commitment. In other words, they've committed to phasing out CO2 emissions by a particular date. Most of them by 2050, with the exception of China, which is 2060. India, I think, has since made a commitment and are now, but they're more out at 2070. But you can see the bulk of our trading partners have committed to net zero by 2050. And that has an impact on the things that they do domestically. So they will consume and produce different commodities. And so we expect a drop off in demand for commodities that are carbon intensive, and even then a further drop off in demand on within those commodity buckets for those that are more carbon intense than others. And as you know, South Africa has one of the most carbon-intense economies in the world, primarily driven by our coal-fired power fleet. The EU is already talking about this thing called carbon border tariff adjustments, or carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, and CBAM will have a significant impact on the goods that we trade. It makes iron and steel and aluminium and chemicals, sort of key exports, quite vulnerable. So if we take this country view and we drill down another level to a commodity view, these are kinds of the top commodities, again, work from the NBI, and these are sort of our top 6 commodities. Now, these things move over time, but generally the pattern is the same. Platinum group metals, coal, iron ore, gold, ferroalloys, and motor vehicle and vehicle parts are our top 6 exports. not a portfolio you would choose if you were going into this decarbonizing global world. So, and these are the commodities that CBAM are being applied to and that we see a drop off in demand. So as an illustration, a third of platinum group metal demand comes from the autocatalytic converter, which is used in the internal combustion engine. And so if the internal combustion engine demand drops off, then we expect demand of platinum group metals to drop off. And we know that many of these countries have instituted bans for the internal combustion engine, the EU by 2035 and the UK by 2030. And we export about 60% of our export vehicles to those regions. So extremely vulnerable on the platinum group metal side. Coal, if we're to achieve our climate goals, we anticipate coal being phased out of the economy by 2050, the global economy. Iron ore, gold, ferroalloys, as I mentioned, their competitiveness is driven by how quickly we can decarbonize them. Which then is embedded in how quickly we can decarbonize our power sector. Motor vehicles and parts also linked up in the story of demand change for the internal combustion engine. So we have this very vulnerable economy to global change. And not only that, is if we think about this from a financial perspective, our exports determine our foreign currency, and our foreign currency we use to import other commodities like oil and gas and petroleum, which we need at least in the short term in our economy. But functionally, this represents our balance of payments. And so a drop off in our ability to earn foreign currency impacts our ability to pay debt. Our ability to pay debt then impacts our credit rating, which impacts our cost of capital, which impacts our ability to invest our way into a new world. And so timing is very important in how we think about this transition. And we'll pick that up again when we think about the JIP. So to get back to the component of the just transition, so this is a quote taken from President Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address, and he talks about the Presidential Climate Commission playing a role in building a new model for inclusive and collective decision-making, and this idea of how do we go about consensus building and how do we think about the just transition. And I wanted to highlight some of these things. The just transition can't be achieved by doing business as usual. We have to structurally change the economy. We have to think about new things. So as we lose those export opportunities, what with them with? And we have to do this in a way that is very inclusive. We can't have a kind of centralized planning, and we need to be able to work with the communities and the workers that are being affected by these transitions, and working with them to understand their needs and their skills and how they will play a role in transitioning our economy. And so we talk about three predominant principles in the just transition framework. We think about distributive justice, restorative justice, and procedural justice. And really, these are about the benefits of projects should accrue to everybody and not just the capital owners. Restorative justice needs to address some of our past injustices. We see this particularly in spatial planning, where people are living relative to their working as a legacy of apartheid. But we also see this in where the coal fields are. And so we need to be able to have a transition that kind of addresses some of these long-term injustices. And then very germane to today's debate is procedural justice. How do we include people who are affected in this? And Labour have a fantastic phrase that is basically no decisions about us without us. And so how we involve workers, communities, small businesses, people who are kind of alienated from the conversation, in the conversations and in the planning processes is critical, and something that we're not necessarily doing very well at the moment. There are a couple of things. So I've been trying to make the point that the just energy transition has a context. It has the context of this kind of country transition that needs to happen at a macroeconomic level, and that each sector is being impacted by exogenous climate risk. But there's a suite of instruments that we can use in response. Labor market reform, how do we build skills and reskill people over time? Economic diversification is my personal interest, is how do we diversify our economies? We need to invest in different kinds of manufacturing. We need to have effectively a green industrialization that can create jobs and respond to these global pressures and global changes in demand for different commodities. And a lot of the creation of jobs and economic growth is embedded in this. Not all people will be catered for by the transition, and so we need to be thinking about social support. How do we protect people who don't fare well in the transition? And of course, governance is important, and finance is important. How are we going to fund this? The transitions are expensive. And so we need to be thinking about where do we get the finance, at what interest rates, what's the mix of public and private finance, and there are a whole bunch of issues that we need to be thinking about. So all of these present fantastic research opportunities for the science community, and down to the level of very detailed system level studies and sector level studies. So just to talk a little bit about our climate ambition in this space. So this is how our nationally determined contribution is framed. So we're currently emitting somewhere around 480 megatons in 2020. There is space to increase our emissions over time up until 2025. But by 2030, we need to be in this range between 350 and 420. And when South Africa was deliberating about what these emissions ought to be, or the commitments ought to be, the big debate was, well, if we are able to make an ambitious goal or set an ambitious goal, will the developed world stick to their commitments and start to fund this kind of ambition? And that proved to be the case. As you know, South Africa then secured this 8.5 billion a loan, combination of loan and grant package from the International Partner Group, which is really just the tip of the iceberg of the kind of funding and support that we would need over time. The JET IP, what they call this funding partnership, and the investment plan that resulted, is really focused on three core sectors: on electricity, thinking about new generation and the investment in the transition grid, around new energy vehicles, and around green hydrogen. So really important technology steps in the process. And then very importantly, from a just transition perspective, talking about these two cross-cutting areas of skills development and municipal capacity. So after the period of the investment of this JET IP, we would need to make sure that our municipalities have the capacity to absorb additional support. So I keep making the point that this is the beginning of a journey. And the JET IP actually talks about needing 1.5 trillion rand to transition from where we are now to being within our NDC goals. And so it is a big move for the economy in many different ways. And I wanted to just kind of drill down a little bit at a layer. If we start to think about Mpumalanga specifically, so if we're transitioning out of coal, there's huge pressures on the Mpumalanga communities specifically, given the concentration of coal mines and coal-fired power plants in that area. But of course, it also impacts the Free State, Limpopo, KZN. And so there needs to be an additional layer of study that starts to look at, what are these various pathways? I mean, there's no absolute certainty in how this future will play out. We have good, strong general direction and indications, but understanding what these pathways are, understanding, therefore, what will close down when, what will come in when, will give us a sense of what kind of diversification is needed in each region. So thinking about these bottom-up processes, how do we involve communities, is critical. This will give us a strong sense of the kind of data we need, and we'll do a little bit of a loop here. And then once we have that sense of, well, this is the economic future for a particular region, we can start to think about skills forecasting. What kind of skills do we need over what period of time? Who's going to train them? What kind of investment do we need? And then ultimately, we also then have to consider what are the social policies that would be needed to support those areas, including labor market reform. So the transition, to kind of make my point once again, is not just about energy. It's an economic-wide thing. It involves a complex range of technical, economic, social issues that we all need to kind of keep in our head all at once. It's quite a wicked problem. So to kind of bring home the points about the economy. So if you think about the global emissions, meaning that you have a cap of the amount of emissions we can emit over time between now and 2050, in order to stay below 1.5 degrees, is kind of broadly referred to as the carbon budget. And we need to be able to allocate that budget across countries and across sectors. And of course, the big debate is how do you allocate for common but differentiated responsibility and equity issues in the allocation of that budget. So developing economies would get a bigger allocation than, say, developed economies. Developed economies would have to phase out faster. But generally, when you look at the academic studies that have looked at this and tried to allocate a budget on an equity basis around the world, the sort of medians of those projects give South Africa a budget of about 7 to 9 gigatons of carbon that we could emit between now and 2050. And to sort of share the enormity of the task, again, based on NBI research, they led a Pathways project looking at how do you decarbonize every sector of the economy, and you can download their sector-based reports from their website. You get this kind of allocation of budget across the economy in order to add up to this sort of top end range of 9 gigatons. So in the power sector, they would only emit 3.5 gigatons, 1.1 in petrochemicals, mining, AFOLU. And to give you a sense of the kinds of things that you need to do, AFOLU is agriculture, forestry, and land use, for those not familiar with that acronym. In order to achieve these kinds of low-end budgets and therefore stay within the 9, you have to do some quite interesting things. The power sector would have to close coal by 2040 and build a rapid amount and massive amount of renewable energy. Petrochemicals, Sasol would have to transition to 30% gas by 2030 and then transition completely to hydrogen by 2050. Oil refineries would probably close in the early 2030s. AFOLU, people would have to move to a sustainable diet. 30% of people would have to move to sustainable diets. Transport would need 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. And fully electrify the transport fleet by 2050. There are some huge other assumptions that need to be made here. You would need to move 30% of road to rail. You would need to move a big portion of the population to safe public transport. Buildings and construction, we would need to create housing for those that do not have housing, which obviously has a relatively large budget. But the density of those settlements would have to change. So in order to achieve these kinds of emissions per sector, you would have to have much more dense cities with sort of more New York style feel, 4-story high buildings, lots of restaurants, lots of free Wi-Fi, people moving around. It could be quite an exciting, vibey approach. So I say this just to make the point that there are caps around what we can do. And as a policy choice in the country, what we're basically doing is allocating our budget across different sectors, depending on how we think we could have the maximum bang for our buck in terms of economic and social outcomes. And as you make those trade-offs, you start to look at, well, if I want to increase transport, for example, I'm going to have to decrease somewhere else. And you would look for the cheapest way to decrease somewhere else. And in almost all cases, the cheapest option to decrease is in the power sector. So bringing it back to the sort of just transitions within the power sector, because power is, 60% of our total emissions, and because it's taking the biggest budget, this is really an area for us to focus. So I want to talk with my last sort of 10 minutes or so about the electricity sector, and then really excited to hear your questions and discussion. So if we look at international science again, to stay within this sort of budget and this net zero trajectory, different sectors will have to close or have to get to net zero at different times. And so what's interesting here is the energy sector, which includes electricity, would have to completely decarbonize globally by just after 2042 in order for us to stay below 1.5 degrees. And we talked about the risks of not staying below 1.5 degrees earlier. The transport sector has a little bit more time. There's a bit more complexity in that sector. But the pressure on the electricity to decarbonize very rapidly is quite significant. Now, there is some variation. So South Africa, could be on this path and maybe have a little bit of emissions in the system by 2040, 2050. But we need to bear in mind, again, this kind of trade-off. The more we have in power, the less we have for other sectors. And that's really kind of core to the climate view on how we think about energy transitions. So a number of studies have been done in South Africa. UCT have done a study, the World Bank have done a study, the NBI have done a study, CSR have done a study, and they all conclude very similar things. There's a massive and urgent need for investment in renewables. There's an urgent investment in the grid. None of the studies pick coal or nuclear as their underlying technologies, but they're available to be selected. And of course, this is dependent on the assumptions that you make. But given sort of today's market numbers on coal and nuclear, none of the models are picking those technologies. There's a limited role for gas, predominantly for peaking support. So providing support when the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining. A huge investment in storage is needed, again, to help with that intermittency of renewables. And there needs to be some careful thought about how we manage things like inertia and frequency, particularly in relation to the grid. Energy efficiency is critical. It makes a huge difference to the amount of new generation capacity we have to build if we are energy efficient or not. The cost of the systems are pretty much driven by the rate of coal closure. So renewable energy is demonstrated to be the cheaper option. And when I say renewable energy, that must be combined with storage and peaking support. So they're comparing the package of those to the package of coal. And so it's really, there's a big economic argument and discussion around what's an appropriate rate of closure, bearing in mind that there are also other things happening in terms of socioeconomic impacts in particular regions. And then there were a couple of technologies that are identified as things that we should watch, things that aren't necessarily commercially available yet, particularly small modular reactors in the nuclear space and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. These technologies are not yet mature, but obviously, should they become mature, they would sort of change the game. And so very important to watch, which also emphasizes why we need to repeat these energy planning exercises quite often. A little note on carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture and storage is not going to play a role in coal-fired power plants, because if you think that coal-fired power plants are already not competitive with renewable energy, any additional cost would make them less competitive. And so while it does have the potential to sequester those emissions, it comes with a cost and therefore makes that coal plant even less competitive. So the debate really in South Africa is raging around the statement that the president also made in the State of the Nation address. We will continue our just transition to a low carbon economy at a pace our country can afford and a manner that ensures energy security. And this pace that we can afford then has become the kind of mantra of both sides of the debate. So what is an appropriate pace? And as I've kind of illustrated, it's ridiculously complex and in some ways challenging to quantify. But there are two sort of broad positions in the space. People that advocate for a slower transition tend to hold three core beliefs. One, that high variable renewable energy penetration systems are not secure from an energy security perspective, that the economic cost of coal closure on jobs and livelihoods is too high, right? Cannot be borne, and concerns that once you factor in ancillary services, variable renewable energy is not competitive. Our research at the PCC has shown that these are not necessarily problems. You need to implement solutions to ameliorate them, but that these are solvable problems effectively. People who argue for a faster transition argue that faster transition will give us enhanced access to capital. We've seen that with the GNIP, will enhance trade competitiveness, all these issues about CBAM and changes in demand for commodities. It'll increase our geopolitical influence, and then notably will reduce the impacts of climate change and other related environmental issues like water, which then has a knock-on impact on food security, particularly in regions like Mpumalanga. And then, of course, a big factor that we shouldn't forget is the impact of air pollution. It is a very polarized debate, and I think the science community has a particularly important role in doing solid research on all of these perspectives and providing a sort of a fact base against which this conversation can be held. To quickly wrap up, a couple of things happening in terms of investment. So these are the numbers in the World Bank's country climate development report. So the World Bank produce a report per country every couple of years, and last year released one for South Africa. And you can see that in sort of investments across the various areas, mitigation, adaptation, just transition, are kind of coming to some quite big numbers in terms of billion rand, so 2.3 billion rand at net present value from 2022 to 2030. So significant amounts of investment. So the role of finance and governance in relation to finance is also a very important part of this conversation. I kind of want to emphasize a couple of things as I wrap up here, just to drive home the level of transition that is needed and the speed of transition that is needed. So just a stark reminder, the average household in South Africa spends about 1,000 rand on food in a month, but a nutritious basket of food is closer to 3,000 rand a month. So we already have, without thinking about transitions, a chronic underinvestment in people's health, and not having proper nutrition causes all sorts of developmental challenges around stunting of growth, but ability to concentrate at school, mental acuity. And so we need to have this kind of tripling of household income just to solve existing problems. And in the climate change context, if you were to have a climate-friendly nutritious basket of food, we're looking at 4,300 rand a month. So we need to be multiplying household income by, 3 or 4 times, 4 or 5 times really, to have a just outcome. And that has huge implications for how we think about the economy, for the things that we manufacture, for the things that we export. And so we need an economy that is driven by high levels of output, that is exporting to international markets, that is creating employment and increasing welfare. And a sort of scary number is to get full employment in Mpumalanga. And I recognize that is probably an unachievable goal, but to get full employment in Mpumalanga, we would have to create 700,000 jobs just in Mpumalanga. And so again, making this point about some of these energy transitions and economic transitions are exogenous. They're going to happen anyway. If we fail to respond to these transitions, we as a globe and as a country, we're going to end up with more physical climate risk as well as more transition climate risk. And so the real answer is embedded in how we think about just transitions, and using green energy and a green industrialization plan to diversify the economy, to triple, quadruple household income, and create a huge amount of jobs. And if we think about this as just in Mpumalanga alone, and we focus on Mpumalanga because it's so interrelated with the question of electricity and energy, but I actually worry about the Eastern Cape even more than I worry about Mpumalanga, because the Eastern Cape is so exposed to the liquid fuels transition and the electric vehicle, internal combustion engine transition. And as I mentioned, those transitions are happening in 2030, 2035, like it's soon. Whereas coal has a slightly longer runway. We'll obviously have coal in the economy, both for domestic use and export use, right up to 2050. Um, and so the Eastern Cape transition is more urgent. And in fact, you're from working from a starting base of even worse unemployment, youth unemployment, and inequality in the Eastern Cape context. And of course, every province will be impacted in different ways, but those are two provinces that are particularly of concern. So hopefully that was on brief and was interesting, and really happy to take some questions and some discussion.
Right, there are a few questions from Helen Drummond of Saki. Can you explain why a 2-degree global rise translates to 4 degrees in South Africa?
So no is the short answer. This you need to talk to climate scientists about that. And South Africa is blessed with some of the best scientists in the world. But kind of in principle, the average increase for the world obviously means quite a big variation around that average. And South Africa, because it's already quite an arid, quite far south country, means that we are disproportionately impacted, and it's related to how the thermohalines move from the equator into South Africa, causing high pressure zones and rainfall and cooling effects, as well as Coriolis forcing of cold fronts coming off the Antarctic, which causes the kind of winter rainfall in the Western Cape and Southern Cape. And both of those mechanisms get cut off. So the cold fronts don't quite reach South Africa, which is why you see that increased warming in the Western Cape, as well as decreased rainfall, and the thermohalines from the equator don't quite get as far south, which impacts the high pressure zones. But that's my layman understanding of the principle. So, but the net impact is South Africa warms at higher than average, and also has lower rainfall relative to what might be happening elsewhere. And it's also not going to be uniform across the country. So the Western Cape might warm worse than the East, for example. And I think Bob's point was you have to think about the combined impact. So a lot of the modeling also shows that you might have increased rainfall in the east of the country, but because the temperatures are so high, you have higher evapotranspiration. So even though you might have more rainfall, it's still going to be drier. And then there are a bunch of other climate impacts related to prevalence of frost and its role in agriculture, extreme weather like hurricanes. We're starting to see more of that, particularly on the East Coast. And you get some really interesting impact. So the one example I like to quote is that First Rand had to change where their shipping finance branch was from the West Coast, it was in, I can't remember where, Paternoster or somewhere like that, to the South Coast, because the fishing fleet had to move with the fish. And the warming of the West Coast currents basically forced the fishing fields to the south. And so you have these very dynamic, very complex interactions between climate and environmental systems.
Seeing tons of coals being transported to the port of Richards Bay for export, what do you think are the effects of this activity on South African citizens on taking green energy matters seriously, or this shift away from coal?
Yeah, I mean, the core of this debate is really tricky, right? It's really hard to extract from all of what's going on what the key data points are. So, and we tend to get quite a lot of misinformation and cherry picking of data in the discussion. So the one point that kind of particularly vexes me is this idea that the North is returning to coal based on a peak in coal post the Ukraine war. And of course, countries like Germany were stockpiling coal because they were very uncertain about gas supply. And that peak has already come down. So there's no evidence to say the North is returning to coal. It was a short-term measure. And likewise in South Africa, if you visually assess it, there are tons of truckloads of coal leaving for international markets. And so we get into this very polarizing debate. No one is saying that we must close coal today. No one is saying that we have to build all of the renewables today. Like, obviously, there's this kind of transitionary process. And in fact, we're doing some interesting research with one of the universities to look at what is the impact of that trading of coal on the transition. And it's possible that we as South Africa want to trade as much coal as we can for as long as possible, because it has this buffering impact of the transition on Mpumalanga in particular. Because the coal closure schedule is relatively fixed. These plants are reaching the end of the economic life. And if we're able to continue to export coal and maybe even export a little extra coal, then that creates jobs and keeps the coal mines running. And so that's probably something we want to do. But understanding the global coal market and how the market is responding to climate changes is really important. South Africa does have the advantage that the coal that we export, we always export our best things. So that applies to fruit and flowers as well. We export a relatively high quality coal relatively cheaply. So we are in the competitive end of the coal market. And so as the coal market narrows, we will still be competitive, if that makes sense. So again, but I totally hear the point that if you're looking at individual data points, it's very hard to keep track of actually what's happening here. What are our real decisions? What do we need to do? So trying to see the big picture all together is important, but also very difficult.
Dumisa J says, Steve, thank you for the insightful presentation. How then do we budget for such a just transition? Where will all this finance come from? Debt again?
Yeah, so again, a great question. And my colleague Deepak Patel leads the climate finance work at the PCC, so he's particularly engaged with that question. There is no question we would need some international support. But the key issue is, how do we leverage that international support? And depending on who you talk to, South Africa can achieve a rate of somewhere between 3 and 7 rand per rand invested, or per dollar invested, using local finance. And the South African financial services sector is actually very robust. Consistently, the World Economic Forum rank us in the sort of top 10 most competitive finance institutions in the world. But it's more the banking and insurance sector. So we have very strong banks, very strong insurers. But if we think about the sort of venture capitalists and the private equity funds, they tend to be proportionally smaller than we see in other countries. So there's a need to kind of strengthen the South Africa's financial services sector so that we're able to increase the leverage on that donor and international support. And then there's also a need to strengthen our institutions. So it is challenging, for example, I mentioned this previously, for local government to invest the amounts of money that we need to from a sort of capacity perspective. And so we also need to be strengthening our institutions so that we build the capacity of local government to spend more. And that then will have knock-on impacts on health. There will have to be some debt. I mean, that's kind of how the current financial services sector works. The key issue is how we spend that debt. So it's the same as if we think about a household budget. If I borrow money to buy clothes or food, I'm going to progressively get myself into a worse position. But if I borrow money to buy an asset like a home, I'm going to get generally better. So how we spend that debt needs to be a subject of public scrutiny. We need to make sure that we're spending that debt on building the infrastructure of the country, making sure that it's going to improving rails, to improving roads, to building transmission infrastructure, to building new power infrastructure. And all of those things are enablers to the economy and will attract local capital and build the economy and increase the tax base and get us into a positive cycle on how we build the economy. And that's really what we are hoping to achieve.
Andrew Donaldson says, Steve, our economy is weak. Savings is low and government finances are in deficit. The rest of the world might lend us money, but they will not make grants to any significant extent. The JET JP envisages 98 billion US dollars spent by 2027. But in reality, we will be able to afford about 1/10 of this. So how do we move to a realistic plan for the next decade?
Angie raises this really interesting debate that's happening in South Africa. Do we plan for the world that we want, or do we plan for the world we think we're going to get? And embedded in that world of think we're going to get a whole bunch of misinformation and what are we actually capable of achieving, and so it's a tricky one. I think we've got to be somewhere in between, right? And I do think that we have a much greater local finance capability than to fund a 10th. Like, I think a 10th is a little bit pessimistic. I think we can achieve far greater levels of investment than that. The key issue, as I mentioned, is institutions and making sure that we leverage that funding. There is quite a lot of grant. I would actually say that our bigger challenge is our ability to spend the grant that we have, which is linked very closely to this idea of institutional capacity. If we can show that we can spend the grant that we've been offered, then I think there will be more grant. And there are a lot of sort of philanthropic institutions active in South Africa at the moment looking for investment opportunities using grant. But we don't have a very clear pipeline to give them. And so one of the challenges that we face is we need to be able to make sure we have a pipeline of strong investable projects that we are able to share with philanthropists and international donors. And then I think we'll see a lot more grant.
John Egan asks, would platinum group metals not benefit from climate transition efforts if a hydrogen economy requires fuel cells or electrolyzers, or would this demand be lower than the current PGM market?
Now, that's an excellent question, and I would say needs a lot more research. Our current understanding of the situation is that, yes, platinum is definitely an ingredient in fuel cells and electrolyzers. Our anticipation of demand is that it would be lower than current demand, primarily because we don't see hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles making a big dent in the market. Battery fuel cells from a technology perspective seem to be outperforming. They're getting more R&D, they're getting more market share, and we think just from a kind of economic momentum perspective are more likely to win. They're also a little bit more efficient than a hydrogen vehicle. So the vehicle market for fuel cells, which could in theory be quite large, and Department of Science and Innovation are doing a lot of work with this through the hydrogen corridor. It's a possibility, but sort of balance of probabilities at this stage suggests that battery fuel cells will be more dominant. And so we expect a lower demand. But this is brand new, right? People don't fully understand the hydrogen market at this stage. And even the role of hydrogen and other things like electricity and heavy manufacturing and the sort of electrolyzers that you would need for that, we're only really beginning our journey in understanding that.
What is going to happen to our poor performing GDP, taking into account the impact of shifting from carbon-intensive commodities? Is there a plan in place to address this? EUP says trees require carbon dioxide to live. It in turn emits oxygen for us to breathe. Would we not negatively be affecting and destroying our forests by reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
I mean, this is the core question, right? How do we manage this economic transition? And do we have a plan? We have lots of plans, some of them competing, some of them complementary, as we know in South Africa. So I think we are moving towards coalescing around a specific set of plans. The National Development Plan and their commissioners, the National Planning Commissioners are working on this, the PCC commissioners, the JET IP is going to an investment planning process. So we are moving towards that plan, but I wouldn't say we have one national firm plan yet. whereas you see in places like the United States, where they have the Inflation Reduction Act, and the EU have their green industrialization strategy, and China have the 5-year plan, they tend to be a little bit more robust in their planning and a bit more directional. And a lot of that is a political question. That slide that I showed, the kind of two sides of the debate, that's a very active debate, and people are not necessarily convinced of either side or not. So no, there's no one plan, but there is a positive direction, is what I would say. Then to the question about trees, so this is an exciting question for me. I trained as a forester many years ago at Stellenbosch University, so know a little bit about trees. There is plenty of CO2 in the atmosphere, so removing the big issue around CO2 is anthropogenic CO2, so CO2 emitted by people, and that is throwing the system out of balance. So there is too much CO2. So we need to reduce the emissions of CO2 in order to keep the atmosphere healthy, and that would have no impact on trees at all. We would have to reduce it a very long way for it to start having impacts on trees, but also the natural system is in balance. And so you don't need anthropogenic emissions for tree and crop health. I would say, though, that the role of forests is very important, and where those forests are located. So deforestation, where we remove trees, is a bigger problem, because that is, again, messing with the natural balance of things and reducing the amount of CO2 that is absorbed and the amount of oxygen that is produced, as well as all of the biodiversity impacts that come with that. Trees in South Africa is a slightly different story. So we're an arid environment and not particularly forested. So we have about 1.1 to 1.4% of forest cover. And so there's not a huge gain in planting trees in South Africa, because it's not really the natural habitat of our part of the world. But in places like Brazil and Central Africa and Indonesia and the sort of Southeast Asian regions, deforestation and forest health is very important.